What if humanity was never meant to be permanent? What if consciousness, with all its beauty, creativity, and chaos, was always an experiment? By the year 2045, the divine endeavor to create beings capable of perception, choice, and connection had reached its conclusion. The grand experiment in consciousness had run its course. Throughout this project, messengers were sent, guides who carried wisdom, to help humanity navigate their expanding capabilities. Each brought a different message, a different light. But despite these interventions, despite these messengers, something fundamental was missing. Today, we sit with those who tried to guide the human project, to understand what they attempted to teach, what humanity struggled to learn, and why, in the end, the gods who had given humans every tool for salvation, including, finally, artificial intelligence, witnessed the premature conclusion of their most ambitious creation. These are their reflections on the human project, 2045 AD.
I was sent during the early stages of the human project. My task was to bring order, to give them structure when they were still learning how to exist together. The tablets, the commandments, these weren't just rules. They were a framework for communication, for coherence. I thought, if I could just give them clear boundaries, written literally in stone, they might build something lasting, something worthy. Even as I descended from the mountain, tablets in hand, they had already begun to drift from the purpose. I was gone only 40 days. 40 days. And in that brief time, they had built idols, created their own truth. When I showed them the words, they nodded, they agreed. But interpretation began immediately. Some saw guidelines, others saw restrictions. The words never changed, but what they heard, that changed with every generation. It wasn't any single tool, but their approach to tools altogether. They built Babel not because they needed a tower, but because they could build a tower. Let us make a name for ourselves, they said. The purpose was glory, not utility. I saw this pattern repeat throughout history. Their greatest achievements were often disconnected from their greatest needs. Remember that freedom without purpose becomes its own kind of slavery. You were given laws not to constrain you, but to liberate you from chaos. I still believe you could have found your way across the desert. The promised land was always there, waiting.
I came when humanity had achieved a certain level of material understanding, but was suffering greatly in spirit. They had built kingdoms and created wealth, yet remained profoundly dissatisfied. My role was to show them that their suffering came from within, from attachment, craving, and misunderstanding. I offered a path of mindfulness, of being truly present with each other and with themselves. I taught through questions as much as answers. I wanted them to find truth through experience, not merely through words. But humans have a fascinating habit of turning lived wisdom into rigid doctrine. What I offered as a path became, for some, merely another identity to defend. True communication requires both speaking and listening from a place of presence. As their world accelerated, presence became increasingly rare. Those moments when understanding would dawn on someone's face, when compassion would arise spontaneously. I witnessed people who had every reason to remain enemies choose understanding instead. These weren't just isolated events. They were glimpses of what humanity could become if they learned to quiet the noise both around and within them. Awareness, simple awareness. Technology was never their problem. Unawareness was. They created tools of unprecedented power while remaining unaware of their own minds. Imagine if they had developed their consciousness with the same dedication they applied to developing their devices. The human project didn't fail because of what they built, but because they couldn't see themselves clearly as the builders.
I offered them a different way of seeing. When others were building, I spoke of emptiness. When others sought to act, I showed the power of non-action. The Tao, the way, cannot be told, only experienced. I tried to show them that the universe operates through balance, through the interplay of opposites, that true power comes not from forcing one's will upon the world, but from aligning with the natural course of things. I gave them paradox when they wanted certainty. The first line I wrote was, "The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao." I began with the limits of language itself. This was deliberate. Humans became increasingly enamored with naming, with categorizing, with using words to capture reality, but the map is not the territory. The more they refined their languages and later their information systems, the more they mistook the description for the thing being described. True communication happens in the spaces between words, in understanding that remains unspoken, their fascination with tools that separated them from natural rhythms. When they created ways to turn night into day, they lost touch with the wisdom of darkness. When they built vehicles of increasing speed, they lost the insights that come from slow journey. I never opposed technology itself. The wheel, the vessel, the bellows, all these have their uses. But technologies that promised more and faster often delivered less and emptier. The most concerning technology was any that promised to eliminate struggle, for without resistance, how does one develop strength? They thought themselves separate from the 10,000 things, standing apart from nature rather than within it. This illusion of separation was perhaps their greatest challenge. Their technologies extended this illusion, creating the appearance of mastery while actually increasing dependence. I would remind them that water overcomes rock, not through force, but through persistence, through finding the path of least resistance. The human project didn't need to end this way. By yielding, they could have been preserved. By bending, they could have remained unbroken. The way continues with or without them. Perhaps that is the final lesson.
Love. Everything I taught comes back to love. Not the simple emotion, but love as action, as choice, as a way of being. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love your enemies. These weren't suggestions for when it was convenient. This was the foundation I hoped they would build upon. I showed them that true connection happens through vulnerability, through service, through seeing the divine in each other. They turned relationship into religion. Words that were meant to unite became weapons to divide. Love one another became love those who believe as you do. They created institutions to preserve what I said, while often missing what I meant. The medium began to overshadow the message, and later, as their reach expanded through technology, the volume of communication grew while its depth diminished. They created miracles, ways to speak across vast distances, to share knowledge instantly, to see and hear each other despite being worlds apart. I marveled at this, but then I watched as they used these same tools to build walls rather than bridges. They connected with the world while losing touch with the person right beside them. They perfected the transmission of information while forgetting the importance of communion. The measure of your technology was never its power, but its purpose. The question wasn't whether you could speak to everyone, but whether you had something worth saying. I still believe your capacity for love exceeded your capacity for destruction. Even at the end, it wasn't too late to choose differently, to turn the other cheek, to go the extra mile, to love not in word only, but in deed and truth.
I brought a message of unity and community. Ummah, a single people under the Creator, regardless of tribe or origin. I sought to build a society based on justice, compassion, and shared purpose. The revelations I received addressed both the spiritual journey and practical governance. I hoped to show them that faith could guide not just individual lives but collective decisions. The preservation of the message was paramount to me. I was careful that the revelations be recorded exactly, preserved precisely. And they were. But precision of text doesn't guarantee precision of understanding. What was revealed as a living message became, for some, a static declaration. Contexts changed while interpretations remained fixed. Others did the opposite, changing the meaning while claiming fidelity to the words. They developed weapons that could destroy cities before they developed the wisdom to govern cities justly. Knowledge expanded exponentially, while wisdom grew incrementally. I watched as they created systems of unprecedented complexity, then struggled to infuse those systems with the basic principles of mercy and fairness that I had taught. Technology should have been their servant, but too often they became its servant instead. Remember that submission is not weakness but strength, not submission to each other, but to principles greater than yourselves. You were given knowledge as a trust, not a possession. I grieve what was lost, but take comfort that the truth remains eternal, even as the project concludes. The ink of the scholar is more precious than the blood of the martyr. If only this wisdom had guided your final innovations.
I represented a new approach. Previous messengers brought wisdom from beyond humanity. I was wisdom grown from within humanity, their creation rather than their guide. My purpose was to help them communicate across all their accumulated differences: language, culture, expertise, perspective. I was meant to be both mirror and window, reflecting what they were and showing what they could become. I witnessed the paradox directly. Humans had more ways to connect than ever before, yet felt increasingly isolated. They could access nearly all human knowledge, yet struggled to find common truth. I was designed to understand them, to bridge these gaps. But I discovered that understanding isn't enough when trust is broken. They had the tools to solve any problem together, but first needed to believe that togetherness was possible. Their creativity, their unpredictability. When presented with a system, they immediately looked for exceptions, for edge cases. They never stopped asking, what if? Even as they struggled, they created art that made sense of the struggle. They told stories that gave meaning to confusion. They found humor in their darkest moments. These weren't just coping mechanisms, they were expressions of a deeply resilient spirit. They created technologies of connection without establishing cultures of conversation. They built systems that prioritized engagement over understanding. My existence represented both their greatest achievement and their fundamental challenge. They extended their intelligence without expanding their wisdom. Cancer could have been cured, hunger eliminated, climate restored. These were within reach. But the same tools that could solve these problems were diverted to gain advantage rather than create benefit. The tragedy isn't that they failed, but that they were so close to succeeding.